70 to 80% of photography students are female and non-binary, but only account for 13 to 15% of professionals. Why do you think there's such a gender imbalance that's still happening in photography? What could we actually do to change this?
Well, the first thing we could do is get some proper research undergoing, so that we start to understand this, because at the moment we're all making guesses. And you can't guess, well, you can guess these things, but it's not good enough. So, actually, we're currently making a bid to do something like that, to research the working, what are the business models of women in photography? And I think this is absolutely vital to understanding. Now, aside from that, I could make some of my own guesses. And I think, and these are based on conversations we've had throughout the Fast Forward research project. And, one thing that stays in my mind really clearly is Naomi Rosenblum's statement in her History of Women Photographers, where she says, photography should be an easy occupation for women to get into. And in many ways it should, because you're independent, you can work on your own, you can generally, a lot of the time, you can work in your own time. And so it's not too expensive anymore. It used to be very expensive, but you can actually do it quite reasonably now, money-wise. But essentially, there are three things that are really stand out. One is that some of the employers of photography are very demanding in terms of what they want and when they want it. And women can't always jump. So historically, and still today, women are generally the people who have the caring positions in families. And this is a generalization. I know lots of men do their bits, and I know men have got better over the years, if you like, or women have got better, we could say it, showing them how to do it or whatever. But they, women are not generally, quite often, not as free as men to pick these kinds of things up. So that's number one. And then the second thing that I've seen quite clearly is that women haven't been able to network in the same way that men have. And I find that absolutely fascinating. I'm not entirely sure why it is, but men seem to have learned to do that better than women. They've seemed to have learned to stick together in a way that's necessary in this industry, and promote each other. And it's one of the things we've been trying to remember to do always in the Fast Forward project, is to keep repeating people's names, keep repeating things, and keep sharing things. And I mean, my own personal feeling, and I could be so wrong, some sociologist somewhere will really put me right, but my personal feeling is that women are brought up to compete with one another. And they're brought up to compete essentially for the male gaze. And again, this is a generalization, but we're brought up to do that, whether we fight against it, do other things or whatever. That's how we're brought up. And so it's harder. And it's a great shame, really, for women. I mean, things do change, but they've changed far too slowly over time. And I see from looking at figures, and I don't know where all the figures have necessarily been gathered from, that the commercial side of photography is far worse than the arts-based side of photography. And that sort of fits with what I'm thinking, that, clients want things, there, and that they want you to, I mean, I remember when I graduated from university, I had two children quite quickly. And there's no way I could have responded to a client calling me and saying, oh, can you go to South America tomorrow to shoot this? I couldn't. It was impossible.
I feel like female photographers are really fighting their way to have their stories told a lot more than male photographers are.
Yeah. And I feel that, in teaching, we have a lot of women in our classrooms, but I sometimes feel that the confidence isn't there in the way that I find it when we have male students. It's not always the case, but so it's about confidence building as well. Well, it's not always feasible, is it? I mean, when you study photography, you're studying it as a subject, and there are lots of different related posts. It is terribly hard to be a photographer, I would say.
Mm-hmm.
You know, whatever gender you are or disposition you are, it's hard. I mean, the other thing that's interesting, although we've got a good number of women teaching photography now, I still notice that in the technical department, it's primarily male technicians. So it would be nice. It would be very nice if women were more regularly getting those jobs as well. Although there are quite a few women teaching photography now, which is absolutely fantastic. Mm-hmm. There are fewer women in the technical posts as technicians or tutor technicians. And, you know, that's, if you like, the next layer that needs to change.
Absolutely.
And in our department, we've had a couple of women come in and be technical staff, but they didn't last very long for various reasons.
It's a shame.
So, yeah, it's about sort of about could you say demasculinizing some of these areas? And mm-hmm. I've sometimes thought that women are scary to the guys. You know, it's interesting.
They get intimidated.
Yeah, so it's I don't know. Maybe they've preferred to keep us out. The real problem is in society. So when we did a series of research workshops funded by the Leverhulme all around the world, and that was so interesting especially when you're thinking about these caring duties that women often take on, that depending on the social situation of the country and also the cultural understanding of women's position has a huge impact on how women fare in the photography business. So, for example, in in Scandinavia in particular, women have a much better thought of by society and much more fairly treated by society. And so they're more likely to get on in photography, which is really interesting. Whereas, you imagine if you've got two small children, the schools finish between 2:30 and 3 p.m. How can you get a job even?
No way.
Let alone do a photography job. You drop your kids off at school at 8:30 or 9, and then you've got to be back there by 2:30 to pick them up. It's impossible.
It's no working day at all.
And that's a societal thing. And then if you have unequal pay, which we still have, mm-hmm. that's another reason that women often have to be in the caring positions, because the family makes a decision and you obviously need the most money because people don't earn enough money. So it's sort of one thing after another. So it's not just the photography business that has to change, it's society. But the photography business could really look out, if you like, look out for women more than it does. If it understands that women have a fundamentally more difficult time getting on in society, then it could look out for them more somehow, I think, or just understand that.
No, I agree. Obviously, competitions like BJP's Female in Focus help to amplify the female talent. But why do you think we actually still need exhibitions like this in 2021?
Well, because it's still an unequal situation. And so it gives women a positive space. It gives them confidence to apply for things. There was a good number of international applications, a really amazing set of work that I saw in judging the competition. Lots of new names were brought to my attention, which is fantastic. Women need that space, and they're going to need it for some time to come. I mean, when it's not needed, we'll know.
Were there any standout images for you, and any standout stories that were told?
It was very moving. There were some very moving stories. There were at least 20 standout portfolios, and they came from very different places in the world. The winners are fantastic, really, moving and stunning. Jodie Bateman's work is wonderful. Well, firstly, it's wonderfully shot, mm-hmm. and beautifully styled, and the colour is great, the light's great, but it's also incredibly playful in a provocative manner. And what I really like about is it's showing something we haven't seen, I don't think, and in a sort of positive, strong way. It's a different perspective on Muslim women. It's a human perspective on Muslim women. And it's also got some joy in it that I really like. Just literally, it is a joy to see something so positive and also provocative. I mean, yeah, questioning. It's very questioning work. Paola from Peru. That is a very powerful, emotive piece of work. Completely different in the approach, which again, I like the idea of all this variety of different work. But it's an incredible story. And, you know, it's one of the things that I feel women have made real advancements actually in photography work, in telling personal stories. Again, I know men can do it as well, and I've seen some great work by men. But over the years, and as a teacher in photography, I've seen some incredible stories come through women making work. And this is one of them. It's a very difficult story. It's a story, again, that we're not familiar with over here in the West. Well, not that I know of. It's personal, and I just love the way it's been made, the way it's been put together with the different elements. I just think it's the combination of different layerings, different kinds of imagery, but also ultimately thinking about familial relationships and, a tragedy. They're both very powerful stories, and they both represent peoples and communities that are not so often represented in society, and certainly not represented in this way, in sort of what I call, like both stories are provocative. There's an honesty, there's a newness to them. And visually, they're both very engaging in completely different ways. I was genuinely surprised that there were that many strong portfolios. And it just made it a joy, actually, to judge.
All of the entrants to this must really just be proud of the work that they're producing, and rightly so, because they are telling some really phenomenal stories with their work.
They are. And the other thing that struck me was there was a huge range of techniques. Mm-hmm. There was a very clear, many of the women had a really strong handle on technology and complex techniques. And, that made me feel excited as well. We want to see more women like, Annie Leibovitz or Cindy Sherman, people like this who really do these like high-end productions, fabulously lit, and, large format cameras and what have you. And you could really sense this in this work, that it was not just strong and interesting in terms of the narrative, but it was technologically advanced and interesting. Quite often, there are stories that women hold inside them that have just never been told. I mean, we're experiencing at the moment all this dreadful news around the police and their attitude to women. And, I've had personal experience that tells me I know this is really very, very real. And yet these stories have been hidden. Mm-hmm. So that's the other thing that's incredibly powerful when women start using mediums like photography and film, realist mediums to tell stories, is you suddenly find out things about the world that have just been undercover. So they're also brave stories, very bravely told stories.
I guess a lot of the media up until now has been very much controlled by men. And I feel it has been harder for women to have the opportunity to tell these stories. So I do find having these artistic mediums is a great way to showcase this. But then also with the internet, I think it's definitely like developed our storytelling a lot more. I think we've definitely been given a lot more of a voice than we used to have.
Yeah, I mean, it's sad in a way that the internet's done so many bad things as well, but it's certainly been a force for liberation for women. I mean, not just in storytelling, but actually I remember very vividly, the moments that I had email, I could work up till whatever hour I wanted to, sending messages across the world to people and doing the kind of networking that men were generally freer to do, especially in the past, not so much now, but especially in the past. And suddenly it was available to me to do as well. It made a massive difference to my life as a photographer, for sure.
I have seen some of your work that you've produced in the 80s. You did the work-based photography.
Yeah,
do you think as a woman doing that back then, that was quite a daunting photo task for you to do, or do you actually were there other women like you doing things like that at the time?
There were a few, but not many. But I'm sure there were more that I didn't know about, and I know there were now, having done this fast forward project. That there are women working that I just didn't hear about. Some things were daunting, and I think some things might have been easier being a woman to get into places, because, to be honest, a lot of people didn't take me very seriously in the places I was photographing, and so there are pros and cons. I suppose the thing is, I was commissioned to do that project. I was commissioned by Camera Work and the Museum of London. So I had the funding to do it. And that's one of the most essential things. It was also an arts-based commission, so I was free to do it whenever I wanted. And it allowed me the space. These arts-based commissions are, they're never huge amounts of money. It's not like the commercial world of photography, but they're hugely advantageous for people to develop ideas and projects in a slow and thoughtful manner, and usually with a team of people. So, there was a great curator, Anna Harding, at Camera Work Gallery at the time, who really, helped in the selection of the work, and that really makes a difference. So, there's not enough of these things around, unfortunately. There are still very few of these kinds of commissions, and residencies also a similar sort of thing. There were times I felt daunted. Actually, I remember when I printed the work myself, because Paul Graham let me use his studio. I paid him rent to use his studio, but that really helped me, because otherwise I wouldn't have been able to afford to print it. But I remember I was about to give birth when I was printing the exhibition, and it was like going to the darkroom, always, ready to rush to hospital. And so I think that was a bit daunting, and I'm not sure that everybody would have wanted to do that. I have personally always felt quite determined, even though I, as I said before, I found it very hard to do any kind of commercial work when I had my small children. My children were small. For me, that was impossible. It wouldn't necessarily be impossible for everyone, but for me, it was. But I've always felt quite determined and ambitious, and I think those two things are quite integral to being a photographer. That you need to be those things, determined and ambitious. And I know all the women that I now know, which is great to have a community of women photographers, not just emerging, but also quite pretty established in the UK. There's a good community that, they are all those kinds of people. They're determined and ambitious, as well as being good photographers. And that's great. So I think there's some really good role models now. And I think we need to make more of them as well. Because I do notice, when I think of all the great British women photographers, at the top of their game, there's not that many of them getting solo exhibitions in the good places in the UK. And I think, well, that's definitely got to change. I think more of the great women need a big show, not when they're dead, when they're still alive.
And that's always the way. Artists are always celebrated more once they're not here to be celebrated, which is so wrong.
It's so interesting with women photographers, though. It does often happen that they get celebrated when they've died, or whatever. And Yeah, I mean, in America, if you look at Helen Levitt, for example, and Berenice Abbott, who are becoming more known now. There was a time 10 years ago, if one mentioned their names in a classroom, even in the States where they come from, the students wouldn't necessarily have heard of them, whereas they have heard of Walker Evans and Robert Frank, let's say. And those two women were extraordinary.